So you've seen some of those beautiful Milky Way photos, some of those starry sky landscapes, and you want to get involved. Well, no problem. We're going to talk about everything you need to know to get started with astrophotography, what you're going to need, where you're going to need to go, settings, everything you need to take into account. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. This week we're talking all about astrophotography. We're going to focus specifically on getting started with astrophotography because there's a huge amount that we could talk about. There's loads of stuff you can do with astro, and it's a really rewarding type of photography as well, because what you actually see in the camera when it takes the shot can often really blow your mind, especially the first few times you do it. It's really, really exciting. So we're going to talk about what you need to get started, the actual equipment you're going to need, what you need to think about, both in terms of location, what you're going to be looking for, which way to face, all that kind of stuff, settings, and then a little bit of post-production as well to get the most out of these photos. Now, like I say, there's a lot we could talk about with astrophotography. So we're going to focus more on kind of a starry sky landscape. So getting those beautiful Milky Way shots, but not necessarily focusing in on, a nice zoom lens focused on Orion's belt, for example, or on the Andromeda galaxy or something like that. We're going to talk about those kind of wider landscape shots with those beautiful starry skies. We're going to talk about how you can get them. Let's get into it. So first up, let's talk about what you're going to need, first of all, to actually go and take these photos, both in terms of equipment and then in terms of where you're going to go. So equipment wise, the first thing, the most important thing, apart from obviously the camera, is we're going to need a tripod. That's because we're going to be using a long exposure. We're going to have a slower shutter speed, so something like 10, 15, 20, 25 seconds, which means we need something to stabilize the camera. Now, I like to take a slightly heavier, slightly sturdier tripod. I use three-legged thing a lot, but I've used Manfrotto in the past, Vanguard. They're all great, and I tend to go for those heavier tripods rather than the travel tripods. That's because if there's any wind or anything like that, and I'm doing this long exposure, I don't want the camera to move at all, because any movement while we're doing this longer exposure is going to introduce a little bit of shake, and therefore the picture will be blurry, and that is something we definitely want to avoid. So a nice sturdy tripod is an absolute must. Next up, of course, you're going to need your camera. Now, I think there's an argument to be made that full frame is maybe going to work better here, because whatever lens you use, you're going to get that wider focal length rather than APS-C or micro four thirds, which obviously is a crop sensor. I think full frame works particularly well for astrophotography, but if you have APS-C, not to worry. I've done astrophotography with APS-C before. We just need to think a little bit about the lens. Now, the lens choice is really important. We want to ultimately go for the widest lens you've got, probably, within reason, we'll get back to that in a second, with the fastest aperture. Now, there's lots of room for kind of what you want to go for here. I've absolutely used zoom lenses, 24 to 70 f2.8. Great. That's a great astrophotography lens for those nice wide starry sky shots. I'll set it at 24mm, but f2.8 is still a nice fast aperture. 16 to 35 f2.8, same sort of thing. You can shoot really quite wide then with a nice fast aperture. But when you start getting to prime lenses, 20mm f1.8, 20mm f1.4, 16mm f1.8, you can get some really fast apertures with a nice wide focal length, which really helps. Now, the reason we want to go for a nice wide focal length, and we'll get into the settings in a bit, is because the wider the focal length, the longer we can actually have our shutter speed before we start introducing star trails. Now, like I say, I'll go through the settings properly in a moment, but essentially, if you leave your shutter speed too long, 30, 40, 50, 60 seconds, the stars will actually start to streak across the sky. The Earth is rotating at such a speed that just that length of time will actually start to leave the stars not as a nice sharp point of light, but as a little line across the sky, which just doesn't look as good. It doesn't look, doesn't look like you're taking the proper shot. You want to have a nice, sharp, pinpoint star. So we have to be a little bit careful with our shutter speed. Now, that shutter speed, the shutter speed we can use and actually still have a nice pinpoint star, is directly related to how wide our lens is. We can leave the shutter speed a little bit longer on a 16mm lens than we can on a 24mm lens, for example. But we'll come to that properly in a moment. So a nice, fast aperture lens with a pretty wide focal length is going to be ideal. Now, if all you've got is a kit lens, don't worry too much about it. f3.5, f4, I've actually still shot at those for astrophotography. It's not the end of the world at all. You can still get some really nice stuff, but the faster your lens, the more light you're going to be letting in. And really, when it comes to astrophotography, as you can imagine, because it's nighttime, more light into the camera is the aim of the game. So we've talked about tripod, lens, and camera. Those are the three main things you're going to need to go out and take these photos. Realistically though, and I know this is not as exciting, I'd probably take a torch, and realistically, I'd probably take a friend as well, because I've been out and done it by myself, and let me tell you, it was super, super spooky. So I always like to take a friend if I can. Okay, so we've talked about equipment, let's talk about location. Realistically, you'll want to get away from light pollution as much as possible. That means going out of the cities, out of the towns to somewhere in the country, somewhere where it's really nice and dark and you don't have all the light pollution filling the air and stopping you from being able to see the stars. Now, I like to go somewhere high up as well because there's two kind of points to that. First of all, I can usually get a nice landscape subject for my foreground, which we'll talk about more in a minute as well. But it also allows me to get a good vantage point to see where I am in terms of light pollution, and I'm not going to be obstructed by things kind of in the distance. So if I'm low down and there's hills in the distance, that's going to cut off part of the sky. If I'm on the hill, I'm not going to have that problem, and I'm going to get clearer shots of things like the Milky Way and just general star shots as well. It makes my life a little bit easier. So somewhere dark and ideally somewhere a little bit high up. Now, if you thought about this ahead of time, you want to try and go for somewhere where you can use some kind of foreground subject. So whether that is, a little bit of a landscape shot, whether it is a point of interest within the landscape. So I've used a lighthouse before. That always works really well, to be honest. A lighthouse is really nice to shoot because you can shoot that with the stars kind of above. But you could use the beach, you could use rocks on the beach, a nice long exposure across the sea with the rocks and stuff like that. It's going to look great with the stars above. And if you don't have anything like that, that's easy to get and easy to actually photograph, you can add your own points of interest for the foreground. So for example, people sitting, torches look great because you get those beams of light. Something in the foreground so that the shot is not just of the stars. Now, I do understand the first time you go and do it, it's very exciting. And I did this, don't get me wrong, I absolutely did this. It's very exciting to just go and photograph the stars. You point the camera up into the sky and you get some beautiful star shots. But realistically, for the really great end photo, to kind of take it above a little bit more, you want to have some kind of foreground subject as well as that beautiful night sky, because that's going to give you a little bit more of a visually interesting photograph. If you are in the south, if you're kind of around the Sussex area, I really, really love using Beachy Head. It's a great spot for that nighttime photography because you can shoot south, which is generally the direction of the Milky Way. You've got a lot of different visually interesting things to use as your foreground, and it's a nice dark sky spot as well. So there's a lot going for that particular area. Okay, so we've gone through equipment, location, kind of a couple of things you want to think about in terms of foreground subject. How are we actually going to take this photo? Well, first up, the camera wants to go on the tripod, so it's nice and sturdy. I will generally also set a 2 or 5 second timer on the camera so that there's no shake introduced from me pressing the shutter. That means I press the shutter, the camera waits 2 or 5 seconds, whichever one I set it to, then it takes the photo. We're going to want to set it to its widest focal length if it's a zoom lens. So let's say a 24-70, which I actually like to use. I'll set that to 24mm and its fastest aperture, f2.8. Now we're going to want to focus on those stars, which is a little bit tricky compared to using the autofocus that we're all really used to on some of these awesome cameras now, because the autofocus on the stars doesn't really work that well. So you're probably going to want to use manual focus. That's generally what you'll get the best results using. Now, the easiest way to do this is crank that ISO up so you can see the stars on your LCD screen on the back of the camera. There's going to be a lot of noise, but we don't need to worry about that. We're just using this to focus. We want to set things to manual focus, and we want to actually start turning that focus wheel very slowly. Now, there's two things you can do to make your life a little bit easier. Use the magnification on the LCD screen to zoom in so you can really see those stars. Find a star that is reasonably bright, one of the brightest stars you can see in the sky, and make sure that's nice and visible on your LCD screen. Then you want to turn that focus wheel slowly until that source of light, that star, that little ball, becomes the smallest that it can be. It'll slowly get smaller and smaller and smaller As soon as it starts getting bigger, you want to stop. Just go back to when it was at its smallest. That's your focus. You want to set that. Now, I generally find this is not quite at infinity, but it's a little bit before infinity, which I always think is really interesting. But there we go. We've got infinity focus just a little bit before, but you want to play around with that. You want that source of light, that little pin of light to be the smallest it can be, and that is your focus. Now that's going to focus on the sky. That's going to get the stars nice and in focus. We can bring that ISO back down now. But let's talk about the settings, then let's talk about how we might want to focus with the foreground as well. So first off with the settings, the fastest aperture available. f2.8, great. f1.8, great. f1.4, great. Now we're letting in loads of light. We're going to want to set that shutter speed to a nice long shutter speed, but we do have to remind ourselves of those little star streaks. And if you set it to something like 30 seconds, you'll probably see those immediately. And sometimes it's useful to do that just so you can see exactly what we're talking about. Now, the easiest way to actually work out how long a shutter speed you can use before you run into problems is to either use the 400 rule or the 500 rule. Now, they're essentially the same. The 400 rule just always feels a little bit safer. But let's talk about the 500 rule because the maths is a little bit easier. So with 500 rule, you want to use 500 divided by your focal length. So if it's 24 millimeters, you do 500 divided by 24. And the answer is the maximum number of seconds you can shoot for as a shutter speed without introducing those little streaks in the sky. Now, if you are using an APS-C camera, you want to convert your focal length to a full frame equivalent. So times by 1.5 or 1.6, depending on what it is. Or of course, micro four thirds, you'd want to double the focal length so that you get the full frame equivalent and then do 500 divided by that amount. Now, if you want to be extra safe, you can do 400 divided by that amount. It'll give you a slightly shorter shutter speed, but you're going to be extra safe as to not to introduce any of those streaks. But I will say this, it is definitely really, really good to kind of do a bit of trial and error when you're taking these photos, because there's no kind of wrong answer, and you might want to actually look at it, do a 20-second exposure, and then zoom in, see how those stars look. Do a 25-second, zoom in, see how those stars look. But roughly go by the 400 or the 500 rule, and you'll be in a reasonably safe zone with those actual star streaks. Now, ISO, it's a good idea to push this a little bit. Start at something like ISO 800, move it up to 1600, 3200. I like to take the same shot 3 or 4 different times with different ISO values. Because that means when I get back and I want to edit the photos, I've got different levels of ISO ready to go. So I can see, okay, how much noise was there with this one, how much noise was there with this one, because sometimes you can't see it so easily on the LCD screen. But when you get back, you realize, oh wow, there was a lot of noise. But that doesn't matter. If you've got a lower ISO one as well, you can go to that one. So I like to, we're in the digital age. We don't have film to worry about. And as long as you haven't got a 2 GB SD card, you can probably afford to take quite a few shots. I also find there's a little bit of trial and error involved in terms of composition, and that's partially just because it's so dark. And also if you set the camera up like this with the fast aperture, the nice long shutter speed, you'll notice that when you take the photo and the camera takes it and then it processes it and then it shows you, the actual end result that you've just taken, so even out of camera, looks different to what you can see with the naked eye. So there's a little bit of trial and error with just composing things like the Milky Way and things like that, because you almost have to take the photo in order to see the composition. Okay, so that allows us to take a photo of the night sky, but you'll notice, especially if you're using a nice fast aperture, that the foreground is a bit out of focus. It's a little bit soft, which is not ideal. So that's another advantage of having the camera on the tripod. We're now going to change the focus, and you can use autofocus if you'd like, but you can also use manual focus to just focus now on the foreground. We're going to take the exact same shot, don't move the camera, don't change the composition at all, but now we're going to focus on the foreground. We're going to merge these two photos together. When we're back at the computer, we can just use masks and something like Photoshop to just put these two things together. That way we have the sky nice and in focus, lovely pinpoint stars, but we also have the foreground in focus as well. Now, of course, when you're taking the foreground photo, you don't have to worry about the star streaks in the sky. So you might want to use a longer shutter speed. What I'll generally do is actually make that shutter speed longer, but actually reduce the ISO down. So I've got less noise, but I've still got a nice bright foreground. Now you could go for 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, whatever you need to do to brighten that foreground enough so that you've got a nice bright foreground in focus and the stars are in focus in the sky. If you'd like to see a full tutorial on the editing process for a night sky photo, we've actually got one on our channel, which I'll pop a link to down in the comments so you can go and check out that video in its entirety. That's actually how to edit a photo exactly as we just talked about, going from 2 photos, one of the sky, one of the foreground, putting them together, color grading, all that fun stuff. There's loads of stuff that you can do with that, and we go through it all in that video. So that should give you a good idea of how to get started with shooting these lovely, beautiful night sky landscapes where you've got the Milky Way, you've still got a visual interest in the foreground as well. And you can get some really, really lovely shots. It's such a rewarding type of photography because it's so interesting to see that end result, because it's something a little bit like long exposure or a time lapse or something like that. It's something that you can't really see as well with the naked eye, but the camera really brings it out. Now, if you have any questions about anything we've just talked about, pop them down in the comments. I'll pop a list of loads of equipment that I use for astrophotography down in the description as well, because there's lots of interesting different things, so tripods, cameras, lenses, there's stuff that I've used which I really like for astro, so I'll pop it all down there for you. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, because there's loads of new content, including tutorials every single week. I'll see you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.